Before we begin tonight's journey, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy these deep dives into history's forgotten corners. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your world. It's always fascinating to see our global community gather here. Now, settle in, maybe dim the lights, grab something warm to drink, and let's explore a story the Vikings themselves rarely wanted to tell. Vikings weren't supposed to know fear. Their entire culture was built on the idea that hesitation was weakness and courage was as basic as breathing. From childhood, Norse warriors heard tales of heroes who sailed into impossible storms, fought giants, and died laughing because dying well meant entering Valhalla with honor intact. Fear was for monks watching their monasteries burn. Fear was for farmers seeing dragon ships on the horizon. Vikings didn't fear. They attacked. They conquered. They took what they wanted and sang about it afterward. Their worldview was brutally simple. If something frightened you, you killed it. If you died trying, that was fine because a good death earned you eternal glory. Dying peacefully in bed, however, was shameful. Your saga would read like a disappointment. This confidence shows everywhere in Norse sources. Vikings insulted kings to their faces, raided fortified cities like they were inconvenient obstacles, and treated defeat as temporary setbacks caused by bad luck or someone else's incompetence. Fear never appeared in their excuses, which makes it remarkable when the sagas suddenly go quiet. Because in certain passages, the boasting stops. The language becomes careful, almost evasive. Specific regions are mentioned briefly, then avoided like uncomfortable family secrets. No heroic battles are described. No dramatic victories claimed. Just silence. And in Viking storytelling, silence screams. These were people who raided across continents, fought armored knights with axes and attitude, and believed destiny was fixed, so worrying served no purpose. Yet there was one group whose lands Vikings rarely raided, whose warriors they didn't eagerly challenge, whose reputation spread without the usual Norse exaggeration. No grand tales, no boasts, just careful distance. The fear wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It simply adjusted the route of the longship. When a culture that treats death as a career opportunity starts hesitating, something has gone very wrong. And whatever frightened the Vikings didn't do it with superior weapons or larger armies. It did it by making them deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. Vikings weren't afraid of fighting. Fighting was the entire point. They built ships specifically to sail toward people who clearly didn't want visitors. Combat made sense. You could see enemies, count them, estimate whether this raid was worthwhile or merely going to ruin your afternoon. Even when battles went badly, at least the rules were familiar. Someone swung an axe. Someone blocked. Someone probably died loudly while insulting their opponent's mother. What Vikings hated was unpredictability. This fear had nothing to do with losing fair fights. They weren't afraid of warriors. They were afraid of situations where their usual advantages evaporated completely, where strength, numbers, and enthusiasm suddenly stopped mattering, where the world itself seemed uninterested in cooperating with Norse battle plans. Vikings expected battles to be noisy, shields clashing, warriors shouting, drums beating to signal charges. If nothing was happening, that was deeply unsettling. Silence wasn't normal. Silence meant something was watching. Then there were fights that never actually started. Imagine landing in unfamiliar territory, marching inland, and feeling watched without ever seeing anyone. No scouts appear. No obvious enemies present themselves. No villages wait to be raided. Just endless forest, deep snow, tracks that vanish mysteriously, and arrows that arrive without warning and depart before you can identify their source. This kind of warfare was deeply irritating to Vikings. They preferred enemies who stood still long enough to be hit properly. They respected strength because they understood it. But this was rude. This was cheating. This felt less like honorable combat and more like being slowly bullied by geography itself. Viking weapons were heavy. Their armor was heavy. Their shields were heavy. All of it worked beautifully on open ground where you could swing freely and move confidently. But when movement slowed, when visibility disappeared, When sound behaved strangely in thick forests, all that impressive equipment became exhausting rather than advantageous. Suddenly, the fearless warrior was sweating, disoriented, and deeply suspicious of every tree shadow. This wasn't cowardice. It was frustration mixed with the dawning realization that brute force was no longer solving problems.
And Vikings absolutely hated problems that couldn't be punched into submission. They didn't fear dying in battle. They feared wasting effort on battles that refused to happen properly. So when Vikings began avoiding certain northern lands, it wasn't because they were weak. It was because those lands refused to fight them correctly, and that was unacceptable. From a Viking perspective, the Sami were not merely distant, they were inconveniently placed. Their lands stretched across forests so dense they swallowed sound whole, across tundra where solid ground betrayed you without warning, and across snowfields where every direction looked identical. Vikings loved coastlines. They loved rivers. They loved places where ships could wait patiently while crews caused profitable problems inland. Sami offered none of that. The Norse sagas mention these regions carefully, often without useful details, like someone referencing a distant relative they hope never shows up at family gatherings. The Sami didn't live in towns that could be surrounded or burned. They didn't farm fields that could be stolen. They didn't build fortifications that could be admired before destruction. They moved constantly, quietly, with the unsettling confidence of people who knew exactly where they were, while everyone else was hopelessly lost. To Vikings, this was infuriating. Raiding required targets, fixed targets, preferably with storage buildings, livestock, and populations prone to panic. The Sami had none of this. You could march all day through their territory and find nothing but snow, trees, and the growing suspicion that you were the problem. Even trade expeditions behaved differently here. Vikings traveled carefully, respectfully, usually with local guides. They didn't swagger. They didn't shout their lineage. They didn't wander off alone. For Vikings, that alone signaled something was deeply wrong. The Sami seemed to exist outside normal rules. They survived where Vikings struggled. They navigated without landmarks. They appeared and disappeared without explanation. It was as if the land recognized them and actively rejected everyone else. That's what truly unsettled the Norse. They weren't afraid of people living beyond the map. They were afraid of people who made the map meaningless. Because once maps stop working, strength means very little. Vikings liked enemies they could blame afterward. A rival clan, a stubborn king, a monk who looked at them wrong. What they didn't like was an enemy that couldn't be stabbed, shouted at, or dramatically defeated in single combat. Sami territory had that problem everywhere. The land itself seemed to resent visitors. Forests were dense enough to muffle sound, turning shouted orders into awkward whispers that went nowhere. Snow absorbed noise like a conspiracy. You could march with heavily armed warriors and still feel uncomfortably alone. Then there was the cold. Vikings respected cold. They lived with it constantly. But this was different. This was cold that punished mistakes instantly. Step wrong, and your foot sank deeper than expected. Move too fast, and you sweated, which then froze, which then became a personal betrayal by your own clothing. Viking armor, usually a proud symbol of strength, became a liability. Heavy gear slowed movement. Shields caught on branches. Spears hit trees instead of enemies. Axes required space that didn't exist. The forest didn't care how brave you were. It cared whether you fit between the trees. Navigation was even worse. Landmarks vanished under snow. Tracks disappeared overnight. Even the sky refused to cooperate, remaining flat and featureless gray that made direction feel like guesswork rather than skill. Vikings prided themselves on navigation at sea, but land navigation here felt like being quietly mocked by nature itself. Meanwhile, the Sami moved through this landscape as if it were familiar hallways. They knew which snow held weight and which swallowed you. They knew how sound traveled, how wind shifted, how animals moved. To Vikings,
This looked suspiciously like magic. To the land, it looked like competence. And that imbalance mattered enormously. Viking raids depended on momentum, speed, shock, fear. All of that evaporated the moment the environment refused to cooperate. Marching became slow. Camps became vulnerable. Fires became visible beacons in a world that otherwise concealed everything. Worst of all, the land never announced danger. There were no warning signs, no dramatic buildup, just the creeping realization that you were tired, lost, cold, and being observed by someone who had none of those problems. The land didn't need to fight Vikings directly. It simply removed their advantages and waited patiently. When the environment itself seems to be on the enemy's side, courage starts feeling a lot like poor planning. Vikings expected enemies to behave politely.
By that I mean, they expected them to stand somewhere visible, preferably yelling, so everyone knew where violence would begin. Even ambushes followed unspoken rules. Someone rushed out, someone shouted, someone made a loud mistake. What Vikings didn't expect was being attacked by people who apparently didn't wish to be seen at all. In Sami territory, fights didn't start properly, they just occurred. A man would be walking, thinking about absolutely nothing important, when suddenly he wasn't walking anymore. Arrows arrived without warning, without sound, without the courtesy of revealing who fired them. One moment there was a group, the next moment there was confusion, shouting, and someone asking the very reasonable question, where did that come from? The answer was usually everywhere and nowhere. Sami hunters understood concealment at levels Vikings found deeply annoying. White clothing blended into snow. Movement was slow and deliberate. They used terrain like it was part of their bodies. Vikings, by contrast, wore darker clothing, carried metal, and made noise simply by existing. Stealth wasn't their strength. Subtlety made them uncomfortable. The attacks were never decisive in any dramatic sense. No glorious clashes, no clear victories, just constant pressure. A man wounded here, supplies disappearing there, camps disturbed at night, equipment sabotaged quietly as if the land itself was misplacing things out of spite. This wasn't how Viking honor worked. Vikings believed in earning victory through confrontation. You fought, you won, you took spoils, you left. Simple. This was attrition, psychological warfare, the kind of fighting that drained energy, patience, and morale rather than blood alone. Worst of all, there was no clear moment to fight back. Charging into forests solved nothing. Shouting threats solved nothing. Swinging axes at trees, while emotionally satisfying, solved nothing either. The Sami didn't stand their ground because they didn't need to. They chose when to appear and when to disappear. They let Vikings exhaust themselves, wander aimlessly, and grow paranoid. Every snapped branch became suspicious. Every shadow looked personal. Eventually, Vikings did something unthinkable. They stopped advancing. Not because they were defeated in battle, but because the enemy refused to be present long enough to defeat properly. Nothing unsettles a warrior culture faster than fights that refuse to happen on schedule. To modern minds, when Vikings accused someone of using magic, it sounds like poetic exaggeration, metaphor, drama. But to Vikings, magic was not figurative speech. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation for things that refused to behave properly. And the Sami did many things that refused to behave properly. Norse sources repeatedly described them as sorcerers, shapeshifters, weather makers, curse throwers. Snowstorms appeared suddenly. Fog rolled in at exactly wrong moments. Travelers became disoriented for no obvious reason and walked confidently in wrong directions for hours. To Vikings, who already believed the world was thick with spirits, this didn't feel like coincidence. This felt targeted. Sami shamans used drums, chants, and trance rituals that looked deeply unsettling to outsiders. They entered altered states, spoke to spirits, claimed knowledge of places no one else could see. Vikings who practiced their own magic through cedar recognized power when they saw it. And recognizing power without understanding it is deeply uncomfortable. Even worse, this magic didn't demand attention. It didn't come with grand displays or obvious theatrics. It worked quietly, subtly, in ways that couldn't be challenged with swords. You cannot stab fog. You cannot duel confusion. You cannot shout your way out of being lost. Weather magic terrified Vikings most. Storms at sea were understandable, but storms inland, timed perfectly to ruin marches or extinguish campfires, felt personal. The idea that someone might influence the sky itself was enough to make even confident warriors hesitate. And hesitation spreads like disease. Once one man believes he's cursed, others notice every misstep. Every stumble becomes suspicious. Every delay becomes ominous. The group starts interpreting bad luck as intentional hostility from unseen forces. This wasn't cowardice. It was logic according to their worldview. The Sami didn't need to kill many Vikings. They only needed Vikings to believe they could kill them without ever appearing. Belief mattered more than reality. When enemies can attack your body, you fight. When enemies can attack your understanding of the world itself, you withdraw. Because no amount of bravery helps if the universe itself seems against you. And from the Viking perspective in Sapmi, it absolutely was. If Vikings had merely believed the Sami were strange, that would have been manageable. Vikings dealt with strange constantly.
What made the situation far worse was that their own mythology quietly agreed with them. Because according to Norse tradition, even Odin, the All-Father, god of war, wisdom, poetry, and questionable parenting decisions, didn't know everything. And some of what he learned from the North. Norse myths describe Odin traveling in disguise, seeking knowledge from outsiders, shamans, beings who lived beyond the edges of ordinary society. In later interpretations and scholarly readings, these figures strongly resemble Sami shamans, masters of trance, vision, spirit travel, hidden knowledge. The kind of people who didn't sit on thrones or command armies, but still made kings profoundly uncomfortable. That detail mattered enormously. Odin was not a god who asked for help lightly. He sacrificed an eye for wisdom. He hung himself from a tree to learn runes. He was willing to suffer, deceive, and wander endlessly if it meant gaining knowledge. So the idea that even he sought wisdom from northern shamans sent a clear message to Viking listeners. If Odin needed their knowledge, these people were not ordinary. And Vikings paid attention to what frightened their gods. The Sami practiced forms of spiritual power Vikings recognized but didn't fully control. Shamanic journeys, spirit animals, divination, weather knowledge. To the Norse, this was dangerously close to satyr, a form of magic already considered powerful, unsettling, and socially risky. Even Odin's practice of it was controversial. That alone should tell you how uncomfortable it made people. Vikings respected strength. They respected courage. They even respected clever enemies, but they feared power that couldn't be measured. The Sami didn't rule vast lands. They didn't command armies. They didn't build monuments. And yet their influence seeped quietly into Norse cosmology itself, like a footnote that refuses to be ignored. This blurred line between myth and reality was deeply unsettling. It suggested the Sami were not just another tribe, but a people existing halfway between worlds, human enough to trade with, dangerous enough to avoid, mysterious enough to inspire gods. When your god of war treats someone like a teacher rather than a target, you don't charge in yelling. You listen. You hesitate. And very quietly, you steer your ship somewhere else. Because if Odin approached them with caution, maybe you should too. One of the most unsettling things about the Sami from a Viking point of view was not what they did, but what they deliberately didn't do. They didn't raid. They didn't conquer. They didn't arrive by ship, burn villages, take hostages, then write poetry about it afterward. To Vikings, this was confusing behavior, borderline suspicious. Because in the Viking worldview, land was meant to be taken, defended, argued over loudly. If someone lived somewhere and didn't want more land, that person was either lying or operating on levels you didn't understand. The Sami didn't build permanent towns that could be captured. They didn't farm fields that could be seized. Their wealth moved with them. Herds, knowledge, routes, seasons. You couldn't burn what refused to stay still. You couldn't steal what disappeared into forests before you finished your sentence. This made them impossible to intimidate. Vikings understood fear as something you imposed. You arrived unexpectedly. You made noise. You demonstrated violence. People panicked. People complied. That was the system. The Sami didn't panic. They simply left, then returned later when Vikings were gone, confused, cold, and wondering why they'd bothered. This lack of interest in conquest deeply unnerved Viking leaders.
An enemy who wants your land can be fought. An enemy who doesn't want anything you have is much harder to negotiate with. There's no leverage, no threat, no prize big enough to justify the effort. The Sami were not impressed by Viking weapons, ships, or reputation. They'd survived generations of brutal winters, famine, and isolation without help. A group of loud foreigners with axes didn't register as existential threat. At best, they were temporary inconvenience. To Vikings, this felt like disrespect. And disrespect is far more irritating than hostility. Worse still, the Sami understood something Vikings struggled with. Ownership of land is meaningless if the land doesn't cooperate. You cannot dominate a place that refuses to support you. You cannot rule snow, forests, or migrating animals with laws and borders. The Sami lived with the land. Vikings tried to impose themselves on it. That difference mattered, because nothing unsettles a conquering culture faster than meeting people who don't care about being conquered. Vikings were not unreasonable people. They understood the value of trade. In fact, they loved trade almost as much as they loved violence, which is saying something. When it came to the Sami, trade was not just tolerated. It was carefully encouraged. Furs, hides, antlers, walrus ivory, and other northern resources flowed south through Sami networks. Vikings wanted those goods badly. They were valuable, portable, and made everyone involved feel sophisticated. So trade happened quietly, politely, with significantly fewer axes involved than usual. But here's the important part. Trade expeditions behaved very differently from raids. When Vikings went trading into Sami territory, they didn't swagger. They didn't show off. They didn't shout their lineage at the top of their lungs. They traveled with guides. They followed rules. They offered gifts. They listened. This wasn't fear exactly. It was respect wrapped tightly around caution and sealed with self-preservation. Raiding, on the other hand, was rare, extremely rare. And when Vikings did attempt it, results were consistently disappointing. There were no great victories recorded, no triumphant sagas celebrating crushed Sami camps and heroic plunder. Just vague references to losses, failed journeys, and expeditions that returned early with fewer men and less confidence, which in Viking storytelling is as close to admitting failure as you get. The Sami were not defenseless traders waiting to be exploited. They controlled the routes. They knew where resources were. They knew which valleys trapped travelers and which rivers disappeared under ice. A trading Viking followed Sami knowledge. A raiding Viking ignored it. Guess which one survived longer? Even more unsettling was the fact that Sami traders didn't behave like frightened victims. They negotiated calmly. They set terms. They refused deals that didn't suit them. They walked away without concern. Vikings were used to intimidating their way into favorable outcomes. Here, intimidation did nothing. You cannot threaten people who don't depend on fixed property. This imbalance created an unspoken rule. Trade was acceptable. Violence was not worth the effort. And when a culture built on raiding decides something isn't worth raiding, that decision comes from hard experience. Vikings didn't fear the Sami as enemies. They feared them as people who made raiding inefficient. And for Vikings, inefficiency was terrifying. Vikings didn't need mass casualties to learn lessons. They only needed stories. And stories, unfortunately for Viking confidence, traveled faster than ships ever could. A raid that failed quietly was far more dangerous than one that failed loudly. When warriors returned home without trophies, without songs, without clear explanations, people noticed. Vikings were excellent storytellers. They narrated everything: victories, defeats, insults, even bad decisions. Silence, however, was suspicious. Men came back with fewer companions than they left with. They spoke vaguely about bad land, strange weather, journeys that didn't go well. They avoided details. They changed subjects. Nothing makes a room more uncomfortable than a Viking who refuses to brag. Around fires and in longhouses, stories spread. Not dramatic sagas, but cautious warnings. Don't travel too far inland. Don't go without guides. Don't camp there. Advice like that was rare in Viking culture. Normally, the advice was, bring more axes. Then there were the missing men. No heroic deaths. No bodies returned. Just absence. Absence is terrifying because it leaves space for imagination. And imagination is crueler than reality. A man who dies in battle is understandable. A man who vanishes invites every unpleasant theory at once. Rumors did the rest. Some said the forest swallowed people. Others claimed the Sami could call storms or confuse minds. Some insisted spirits led travelers in circles until they collapsed from exhaustion. The exact details varied, but conclusions were always the same. Something about that land was not worth testing. Stories were not told loudly. They were told carefully, quietly, with seriousness that discouraged jokes. And when jokes stopped, fear had already won. Younger warriors listened closely. Leaders adjusted routes. Traders became more cautious. Maps were redrawn, not with ink, but with habit. Ships went elsewhere. Expeditions chose safer targets. No announcement was ever made. Vikings didn't declare fear. They simply stopped going. This is how fear truly spreads, not through panic, but through habit, through choices that quietly shift, through roads no longer taken, through places that become someone else's problem. The Sami didn't need armies to defend their land. They didn't need walls or banners. They needed only reputation. And once reputation settles in a warrior culture, it's nearly impossible to remove. Because you can defeat an enemy, but defeating a story is much harder. The Vikings never announced their fear. There was no proclamation, no council decree, no dramatic speech declaring eternal avoidance. That would have been humiliating. Vikings didn't formalize fear. They practiced it silently. Instead, fear showed up in absence. Certain routes stopped being used. Certain hunting grounds became inconvenient. Certain journeys were postponed indefinitely, which is Viking for absolutely not. Maps weren't erased, but they grew vague in those areas, filled with empty space where details should have been. When asked about those regions, people answered with shrugs, short replies, or stories that ended abruptly. This quiet behavior mattered. Vikings were not subtle people. They celebrated victories loudly and mourned losses dramatically. When something scared them, absence of noise was the signal. Fear didn't roar, it whispered, and everyone listened. No one bragged about venturing deep into Sami territory. No one claimed glory there.
Young warriors were not encouraged to test themselves in those lands. Instead, elders recommended safer targets, closer coasts, easier prey. And elders in Viking society were not ignored lightly. These were men who'd survived long enough to have opinions worth hearing. Even the sagas reflect this discomfort. The Sami appear briefly, strangely, often without clear explanation. They're described with distance, as if naming them too directly might invite attention. Viking storytelling loved detail, insult, exaggeration. The restraint here is noticeable. This is not how you write about enemies you feel confident defeating. Fear also shaped etiquette. When Vikings encountered Sami traders or guides, they behaved differently. Less shouting, more listening, more respect. The kind of respect that doesn't come from equality, but from uncertainty. You treat people carefully when you're not sure how much power they actually have. So fear settled into routine. Ships sailed elsewhere. Expeditions turned back earlier. Borders remained undefined. No one needed to say anything out loud because behavior said everything. The North remained quiet, not because it was empty, but because it was avoided. The Sami didn't chase Vikings away. They didn't threaten them openly. They didn't conquer anything. They simply remained where they were, unchanged, while Viking attention drifted elsewhere. And in a culture that defined itself through action, that quiet avoidance was the loudest admission possible. Fear doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just changes your plans. The Sami did not defeat the Vikings in any traditional sense. There was no decisive battle where shields shattered and songs were written afterward. No great Viking leader fell dramatically in snow while shouting something poetic. That would have been easier to process. That would have fit the Viking worldview nicely. Instead, the Sami did something far more unsettling. They remained unreachable. They were not stronger in numbers. They didn't possess superior weapons. They didn't overwhelm Viking forces with brute strength. What they had was something Vikings struggled with deeply: the ability to exist beyond control. The Sami didn't stand still long enough to be conquered. Their camps moved. Their wealth traveled with them. Their lives were organized around seasons, animals, routes that only they fully understood. Vikings couldn't pin them down, surround them, or force them into the kind of conflict Vikings knew how to win. This was infuriating. Vikings liked problems with solutions. Build more ships. Bring more men. Hit harder. But how do you hit someone who isn't there when you arrive? How do you intimidate people who simply vanish into terrain that actively dislikes you? Every Viking advantage dissolved the deeper they went inland. Heavy armor slowed them. Loud movement gave them away. Ships became irrelevant. Supply lines turned fragile. Meanwhile, the Sami lost none of their advantages. They moved faster, carried less, relied on knowledge rather than force. From a Viking perspective, this felt unfair, and unfairness is often mistaken for danger. The Sami didn't need to win battles. They needed to make Viking presence expensive, exhausting, unrewarding. Over time, that strategy worked perfectly. Viking leaders began asking practical questions. What do we gain? What do we lose? Is this worth it? Those questions rarely ended in enthusiasm. The Sami were not an enemy you could defeat. They were an environment you had to endure. And Vikings already had enough trouble enduring the actual environment. So Vikings did what any rational warrior culture does when faced with opponents it cannot dominate. They disengaged. They chose easier targets, richer lands, softer coasts, places where victory came with loot and stories rather than frostbite and confusion. The Sami were not terrifying because they killed Vikings. They were terrifying because they could not be controlled. And for a culture built on domination, control mattered more than victory. For all the shouting, raiding, and enthusiastic axe-swinging, Vikings were not stupid. Reckless, yes. Loud, absolutely. But stupid? No. They paid close attention to patterns, especially patterns that involved men not coming home. The Viking world prized courage, but it also respected experience. And experience had a way of quietly setting boundaries. Certain seas were avoided in winter. Certain coasts were only raided once. Certain rivers were approached carefully. And certain lands far to the north slowly earned reputations that discouraged enthusiasm. This was not defeat. It was calculation. Viking leaders understood something important. Not every place was worth the effort. Raiding worked best when rewards were clear and resistance behaved predictably. Monasteries were perfect. Towns were excellent. Wealthy coasts were practically begging for it. Sami territory offered none of that.
No cities, no hordes, no terrified populations waiting to be exploited. Just cold forests and people who refused to cooperate. Over time, Viking attention shifted elsewhere, not because they were driven out, but because they chose not to return. Routes were adjusted, targets reconsidered, expeditions planned with more realism and less optimism. This was Viking pragmatism at work. They understood that bravery without reward was pointless. A warrior who died gloriously but achieved nothing useful was still dead. And dead men don't raid again. Leaders who repeatedly sent men into hostile land without profit didn't stay leaders for very long. So Vikings adapted. They respected limits, even if they never admitted fear. The North became a place you traded with carefully, traveled through cautiously, and spoke about vaguely. No banners were planted, no victories declared, just quiet acknowledgement that some places resisted domination without ever needing to fight directly. This recognition was deeply un-Viking, and that's precisely why it mattered. Vikings didn't believe they were invincible. They believed they were practical. When faced with something that refused to break, they moved on. They didn't romanticize failure. They avoided it. And in doing so, they revealed something rarely discussed. Vikings were not fearless because they lacked fear. They were fearless because they chose when fear was worth listening to. And in the case of the Sami, fear was telling them something very sensible. Stay away. In the end, the Sami did not terrify Vikings by defeating them, slaughtering them, or humiliating them in glorious battle. That would have been easy to understand. That would have fit neatly into the Viking mental filing cabinet labeled, "Things we'll fix with more axes." Instead, the Sami terrified Vikings by refusing to be controlled. They didn't play by Viking rules. They didn't fight wars the Viking way. They didn't build cities to conquer or fields to seize. They lived lightly, moved freely, and relied on knowledge rather than force. And in doing so, they quietly dismantled everything Vikings relied on to feel powerful. Vikings were masters of domination. They believed the world could be shaped through strength, fear, and reputation. Most of the time, they were right. But the Sami world resisted shaping. It absorbed violence without responding in predictable ways. It turned strength into exhaustion and confidence into irritation. That was terrifying. Fear for Vikings was not about death. They expected death. They welcomed it, at least in theory. Fear was about uncertainty, about situations where effort didn't guarantee results, about places where courage didn't translate into control. The Sami represented all of that. They were not louder than Vikings, not richer, not more aggressive. They were simply impossible to dominate. And that's why Viking interest faded, not with rage, not with retreat, but with quiet avoidance. History often celebrates conquerors, but it forgets the power of endurance. The Sami didn't need to defeat Vikings. They only needed to outlast them. And they did. Their lands remained theirs. Their culture endured. Their way of life continued long after Viking raids turned elsewhere. So yes, Vikings were feared across Europe, but they feared something too. They feared a people who could not be conquered. They feared a land that would not submit. They feared the uncomfortable truth that not every problem could be solved by force. And sometimes, the most powerful victory is simply refusing to lose.